from an army standing at the gates of Vienna with all of Western Europe defenseless in front of them, to that same army turning around, packing up, and marching 6,000 miles home, to a king hiding on an island in the Adriatic Sea, convinced his entire kingdom was already gone. This is the death that saved Europe from the Mongols, explained. An invasion so total, so terrifyingly efficient, that the only thing that stopped it wasn't a battle, it wasn't a wall, it wasn't a hero, it was one man dying of a hangover 4,000 miles away. But let's rewind. Because to understand how close this actually was, you gotta understand what Europe was up against. And I promise you, once you hear it, so close is gonna feel like an understatement. In 1206, a man born Temujin united the tribes of the Mongolian steppe and took the name Genghis Khan. By the time he died in 1227, he'd built the largest connected land empire in human history, and he wasn't even close to finished. 'Cause here's the thing about the Mongols, nobody tells you in school. They weren't just raiders. They were the most advanced military machine on the entire planet. Full stop. And the disrespect for everyone in their path came in 3 flavors. Number 1. Mobility. Every single Mongol warrior rode with multiple horses, rotating them so the army never had to stop and rest. They could cover 60 miles a day. European armies moved at a fraction of that. By the time a city knew the Mongols were coming, the Mongols were already there. Number 2. The composite bow. A Mongol horse archer could hit a target while riding at full gallop, firing farther and harder than most European crossbows, and they trained on horseback from the time they could walk. This wasn't a soldier with a weapon. This was a weapon that happened to look like a person. Number 3. Discipline. The Mongol army was organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, with brutal, ruthless accountability at every level. If one man in a unit of 10 fled a battle, the entire unit could be executed. Cooperation wasn't encouraged. It was mandatory, on pain of death. Yeah, that's gonna be a problem for literally everyone they meet. And there's a 4th thing, honestly, that might matter more than any of it. Psychological warfare. The Mongols wanted their reputation to arrive before their army did. Cities that surrendered without a fight were often spared. Cities that resisted were made into examples so brutal that the next city down the road usually didn't bother resisting at all. Terror was a weapon, and they used it just as deliberately as the bow. Genghis Khan died in 1227, and here's where it gets complicated, 'cause the Mongols didn't hand power down the way European kingdoms did. The next great Khan had to be chosen and confirmed by a Kurultai, a formal assembly of every prince of Genghis Khan's bloodline. It wasn't optional. It wasn't symbolic. Every single person with royal Mongol blood was expected to show up in person, or the whole empire's legitimacy was in question. Remember that rule. It matters in about 4 minutes, and it's gonna matter more than anything else in this entire story. Ogedei Khan, Genghis's 3rd son, was confirmed as the new Great Khan in 1229. He was smart. He was an effective administrator. He built the Mongol capital at Karakorum from scratch, and he also drank an absolutely staggering amount, to the point where his own family reportedly tried to limit how much wine he was allowed per day. Keep him in mind too. He's the whole plot twist. In 1235, Ogedei greenlit the Western campaign, sending Mongol forces toward Europe under 2 men who are about to become the most terrifying double act in medieval history. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan through his eldest son Jochi, was the political commander. Ambitious, sharp, and sitting on a legitimate claim to lead. And riding alongside him was Subutai. And I need you to actually sit with who this guy was for a second, because he might be the single most underrated military mind in all of human history. Subutai was born a blacksmith's son, illiterate, with 0 noble blood, and he rose purely on brutal competence to become the general who conquered more territory than any commander before or since, including Alexander the Great. This man planned multi-army pincer campaigns across 1,000 miles of unfamiliar terrain, with no satellites, no radios, nothing but riders and timing. And it worked, every single time. But here's the thing that made Batu and Subutai so dangerous together. Batu had the bloodline and the political authority to hold the whole operation together, because you don't get multiple Genghisid princes to cooperate on a single campaign without someone in the room who outranks all of them. And Subutai had the actual battlefield genius to make impossible plans work. Two armies, hundreds of miles apart, hitting two different kingdoms within 48 hours of each other, using messenger relays and pre-arranged timing across terrain neither of them had ever personally scouted. That's not luck. That's the most sophisticated military coordination anywhere on Earth in the year 1241. Full stop. And most people have never even heard Subutai's name. By 1237, this combined force turned toward Russia. And here's the part that should have been the whole world's warning shot. City after city fell. Ryazan, Moscow, Vladimir, and on December 6, 1240, Kiev, the crown jewel of the Rus principalities, was overrun and burned. A contemporary account describes the ground around the city so covered in bones that a visitor years later couldn't even walk through without stepping on skulls. Kiev wouldn't fully recover its population for a century. And this is the part historians always skip. Europe barely noticed. Russia felt like somewhere else, somewhere far away, somewhere that couldn't possibly be a preview. Some Western European chroniclers at the time genuinely believed the destruction happening in the East was a distant, disconnected disaster. The kind of thing you read about and shake your head at and go back to your dinner. Nobody was preparing. Nobody was building alliances. Nobody was stockpiling weapons or fortifying borders. Because almost nobody in Paris or Vienna or Rome actually believed this was coming for them. Spoiler alert, it was absolutely coming for them. But that's nothing compared to what happens next. In early 1241, Subutai split the Mongol force into two coordinated armies, hundreds of miles apart, timed to strike almost simultaneously, a level of long-range battlefield synchronization that European commanders literally could not conceive of. One army, under commanders Baidar and Kadan, drove north into Poland. The other, the main force under Batu and Subutai, drove into Hungary. On April 9, 1241, at the Battle of Legnica, the northern Mongol force crushed a coalition of Polish, German, and Templar knights. Duke Henry the Pious of Silesia, who led the coalition, was killed in the fighting, and the Mongols reportedly cut off the ears of the dead to count the bodies. 9 sacks of ears. That's the tally one chronicler recorded. 2 days later, on April 11, 1241, at the Battle of Mohi, the main Mongol army obliterated the army of King Bela IV of Hungary, one of the largest forces any European kingdom had fielded in decades. Estimates put Hungarian losses at tens of thousands of men in a single engagement. Bela barely escaped with his life, fleeing west with Mongol riders in pursuit, eventually hiding on a fortified island off the Dalmatian coast, hoping the entire ocean between him and the mainland would be enough. Think about that for a second. Bela IV wasn't some minor duke. He was the king of Hungary, ruler of one of the largest kingdoms in Christian Europe. And within days of Mohi, he was a refugee on his own coastline, watching the horizon, waiting to see if the water would be enough to save him. That's not a king losing a battle. That's a king watching his entire world end in real time. Wait, why did nobody stop this? Because there was no one left to stop it. Two coordinated armies, hundreds of miles apart, had just wiped out the two strongest remaining military forces standing between the Mongols and the rest of Western Europe in 1 week. And that's where things get interesting. By the end of 1241, the Mongols occupied the entire Hungarian plain. Scouting parties rode as far as the outskirts of Vienna. Raiders reached the Adriatic Sea chasing Bela's shadow. Contemporary chroniclers in Austria, Germany, and Italy were writing letters describing what they thought was the literal apocalypse arriving on horseback. Pope Gregory IX was calling for crusades that nobody had time to organize. And the plan on the table for spring 1242 was simple. Keep going. Into Austria. Into Germany. Into Italy. There was, as far as anyone in Europe could tell, nothing left that could stop them. Remember that name I told you to hold on to? Ogedei Khan. It matters right now. On December 11th, 1241, in Karakorum, 4,000 miles away from the frozen edge of the Hungarian plain, Ogedei Khan died. Most accounts point to complications from decades of heavy drinking, possibly after a hard night following a hunting trip. Not a battle wound, not an assassination, just a body that had finally had enough. And here's the crazy part. Under the Kurultai rule I told you to remember, every prince of Genghisid blood, anywhere in the empire, was now obligated to return to Mongolia to select the next great Khan. And Batu Khan was a prince of the blood. So was Baidar. So was Kadan. So was practically every senior commander, leading the invasion of Europe. The messengers carrying that news took months to reach the front. But when they arrived, sometime in early 1242, they carried an order that didn't ask for permission. The Western campaign stopped in its tracks. Oh boy, here we go. Through the spring of 1242, the Mongol armies that had annihilated two kingdoms in a single week began withdrawing east. Out of Hungary, out of Poland, back across a continent they had just spent 5 years conquering, headed home for a funeral and a succession dispute that had absolutely nothing to do with Vienna or Rome, or anyone else in Western Europe who was busy praying for a miracle. They got one, they just didn't understand why. Now, I got to be honest with you, historians argue about this, and it's worth knowing both sides before you pick one. Some argue the withdrawal wasn't purely about the succession, that the Hungarian plain simply couldn't support the Mongol cavalry's massive horse herds through a wet spring, that supply lines were stretched to their absolute limit 4,000 miles from Karakorum, that Subutai had already achieved what he came for. And that's a real defensible argument. But here's the thing, that argument can't get around. The withdrawal happened at exactly the moment the succession crisis demanded it. Every senior Genghisid prince left at exactly the same time, and the campaign was never, ever resumed. Not that year. Not the next decade. Not ever again at that scale. So I want to know what you think, because this is the one I genuinely can't call myself. Was Ogedei's death the actual reason Western Europe survived? Or was it just convenient timing, on top of a campaign that was already running out of road? Hero moment for European history, or coincidence wearing a hero's costume? Drop your answer in the comments, cause I've seen historians argue both sides, and I want to see you argue it too. Batu Khan never made it back to Karakorum in time to have any real influence over who became the next great Khan. Ogedei's widow Toregin, a sharp and politically ruthless operator in her own right, ran the empire as regent for nearly 5 years, quietly outmaneuvering rival factions and steadily building support for her son behind the scenes, while the Western campaign sat frozen, half-finished, its momentum bleeding out with every month the succession dragged on. And when Ogedei's son Guyuk was eventually confirmed as Great Khan in 1246, he and Batu despised each other so thoroughly that Batu simply never returned west again. He settled permanently along the Volga River and built what would become the Golden Horde, a Mongol successor state that would dominate Russian politics for the next 250 years. The invasion of Western Europe wasn't cancelled. It just quietly, permanently, never got rescheduled. And here's the part that still messes with me. Subutai, the greatest military mind of the century, the man who planned the whole thing, lived another 8 years after leaving Hungary. He never went back west. He fought campaigns in China instead, thousands of miles from the continent he'd already broken open, and died in 1248 without ever finishing the one invasion that would have reshaped the entire map of Europe. The greatest general most people have never heard of walked away from total victory and never once got to close it out. Here's what I need you to sit with for a second. In April of 1241, in a single week, 2 coordinated Mongol armies destroyed the 2 strongest military forces Poland and Hungary could put in the field. There was no third army, no secret reserve, no last-minute alliance riding to the rescue. The road to Vienna, to the Holy Roman Empire, to Italy, to the entire rest of Western Europe was open, and the thing that closed it wasn't a general, wasn't a wall, wasn't a prayer answered. It was a hangover in a palace 4,000 miles away that nobody in Vienna had ever heard of, killing a man that nobody in Vienna could have named. And you can still feel the shape of that today. Modern historians studying near-miss moments in history point to 1241 constantly, because it's one of the clearest examples on record of a civilization's entire future hinging on a single unplanned biological event rather than anything decided on a battlefield. No treaty saved Vienna. No coalition saved Rome. A funeral did. So one more time before we go. Hero moment for Europe or just convenient timing? I want your actual answer, not a shrug, down in the comments below. And if this one got under your skin even a little, do me a favor, hit subscribe, cause this channel lives and dies on people who actually stick around for the next classified file. Drop a comment with your answer, cause I read every single one, and the arguments in there are honestly better than half the history books I've read. And if somebody in your life needs to hear how close this actually was, share this video with them, cause apparently nobody taught this in school, and that's a crime. I'll see you in the next one.